I recently witnessed a conversation about LGBTQ issues, and as it does with most political or philosophical conversations, someone eventually succumbed to the temptation to rely on a slogan to try to make their point. And you know that when any philosophical discourse descends to the level of slogans, the first victim is the truth, because what else are we trying to do when we have these kinds of conversations if it's not to help each other come to some better understanding of the truth? But as soon as we start to rehearse slogans in place of communicating the actual content of our thoughts, it's obvious that to whatever degree we may have been committed to the truth, it has now been lost to a desire to simply shut down the conversation with witticisms. And in this case, the slogan was one that most of us should be familiar with because it's been hammered into us culturally. The slogan was "Love is love." And unless you have an equally concise and seemingly clever slogan at your fingertips, I mean, what can you say in reply to that? Quick thank you from this week's sponsor, the Saint Maker. We all want to become saints. The truth is, many of us spend our lives running from distraction to distraction, and even for dedicated Catholics, our quest for sainthood often takes a backseat. The Saint Maker is the first high-performance planner for the spiritual life made by faithful Catholics for faithful Catholics. Combining the practices of Catholic tradition throughout time with the science of personal productivity, the Saint Maker will help you grow in virtue and structure your spiritual life while getting organized and achieving ambitious goals. And that can actually help you become a saint. Saint Maker is a beautiful, easy to carry, and well-crafted companion to your Missal, Bible, and Rosary. It's published 4 times a year, each season including daily planning pages, feast days, and devotions for both forms of the liturgical calendar, goal-setting pages, confessional journals, and a lot more. There are lots of great and influential Catholics using the Saint Maker, like Scott Williams, CEO of Sock Religious, best-selling author Sam Guzman, YouTubers like Dina Barco and Amber Schneider, and priests like Father Dean Marshall and Father Corey Sticka. So give it a try, and if you decide that it's not for you, you can send it back for a full refund within 90 days. Order yours at thesaintmaker.com. That's thesaintmaker.com. If you use the promo code Brian Holdsworth, you'll get 10% off. And if you order now, you will get your planner by the start date of the season, which is April 1st. Part of the difficulty in replying to a slogan like that is that it doesn't contain any content. It doesn't mean anything. Imagine being in a conversation with somebody in which you're trying to advance that conversation towards some sort of intended mutual understanding, and the person you're talking to just starts to speak in riddles, or they just start stringing words together that have no logical connection to each other. The whole thing at that point would become futile because you can't actually have a meaningful exchange anymore. My frustration with this particular slogan is that it purports to tell us something important about love itself, but it doesn't. If you simplify the logic of that statement, all it communicates is that love is true, or simply love is. It only tells us that love is, but it doesn't say anything about what love is. Like, imagine if someone who was colorblind asked you if you could tell them something about what red was like, and you simply reply by saying, well, red is red. It tells us that red exists, or that love exists, but what it is, how do we recognize it, what are examples that conform to what love is, and what are examples that violate what love is, all of that is unanswered. And specifically, what love is and what reflects that definition was the point of contention within that conversation I was describing. Nobody there denied that love exists, but they did disagree about what defines love, and that slogan does nothing to advance either position. And in my experience, if you press somebody to provide a coherent definition of what love is, one that satisfies all the instances that we might think of as being examples of love, it usually follows a thread something like this. They'll start by insisting that love is a feeling. It's an intense attraction towards someone or something. But there's an array of problems and inconsistencies with this kind of a definition. The first is that we just don't control our feelings or our moods. Today I might be in the mood to get up early, to exercise, and to be really productive, but tomorrow I might not feel like that. My feelings on the matter are inconsistent and therefore incoherent. What I ought to do should be based on my reason rather than my feelings and my mood. And most people insist that love is this great, noble, and maybe even virtuous thing. But how can something so noble be the mere byproduct of something we have no control over? Again, our feelings and our mood swings. How can we say that we admire someone for the extent of their love and be critical of someone who lacks love for their neighbor when it's only a feeling of intense attraction? Neither can be held accountable for their surplus or their deficit of love. If we're going to insist on admiring or criticizing people for the amount of love that they exhibit, then we have to admit that there's a dimension of choice involved in what it means to love or not to love, because it is the choices of others that we admire, not their mood swings. The second problem with this definition is that it leads to absurdities when we try to apply it in real life. For example, what do you call someone who has intense feelings of attraction for someone else who doesn't reciprocate those feelings? I think we would call that person a stalker. It's not an admirable thing when someone relentlessly expresses intense feelings of infatuation when they aren't mutual. Or on an even darker level, what about an adult who has intense feelings of physical attraction for children? I don't know if society is actually this far gone, but I'd like to think that most of us wouldn't call that love. So you might want to amend that definition to be something like intense feelings of attraction that are welcomed and reciprocated. But we can still run into trouble because what if a minor reciprocates intense feelings to an adult, like a student to a teacher? Is that love? And don't we all know of someone or a couple who has been swept up in an intense romance, but in which was so volatile that there would often be abuse present within a relationship like that? Relationships like that can hardly be described as a consequence of love. At least not the kind of love that is worthy of admiration. So what are we left with? Well, the only definition that I've ever heard that I find satisfying and that can be applied to all the various instances that we might seriously describe as love just so happens to be the Catholic definition. According to it, love is willing the good of another. So when I say I love my kids, I'm not talking about how I feel about them in a given moment or mood. I'm talking about my commitment to always being concerned for their good. When I say it to my wife, it reflects the unique dimensions of intimacy that we enjoy within that relationship. But I can also say that I love my mom, my kids, my dog, and my friends. And if by that expression I mean I'm committed to their good, then it's coherent and it makes sense in all of those examples. So whether you're talking about helping a person in need or being monogamously committed in a sexual relationship, this definition still fits that broad range of examples that would fit within it. Any attempt to make it all about feelings doesn't always work, because we often admire someone who will help someone in need, especially if doing so is a sacrifice or a hardship for them. And that can hardly be described as an example of someone operating out of an intense attraction to do something, but it is almost always universally recognized as an act of love. And that brings me back to the original contention regarding LGBTQ issues. And for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to narrow that down to same-sex relationships. Because if you want to say that same-sex relationships are true expressions of love, as those who have appropriated phrases like love is love seem to insist, then there is an onus to demonstrate how that kind of relationship is one that conforms and promotes that universal definition. Well, you might say the same way that an opposite sex relationship does. It offers companionship and sexual pleasure. So let's consider those and take them in turn. Companionship, I mean, that certainly is a dimension of life that offers opportunity to love and will the good of another. It gives us an opportunity to share our resources, to help someone when they are struggling, and to encourage them when they are doing well. But nothing about companionship necessitates sexual contact. And that's the point of inquiry. The question is, what is it about a sexual relationship that produces the good of another? Like, I have dozens of relationships that offer varying degrees of companionship, and only one of them has a sexual dimension, which is the one I have with my wife. But if sexual contact were introduced to any of those other relationships, the effects would be disastrous. So again, I ask this question: what is it about a same-sex relationship that is sexual in nature that can be said to help will the good of another? Since it doesn't uniquely offer companionship, all we're left with is sexual pleasure. And that's a problem for me, because are we really going to say that pleasure is a measure of moral good? Because pleasure can often be present in a variety of situations that are clearly not good for anyone involved. Imagine if I, as someone who has never tried recreational drugs like heroin or crystal meth, just gave it a go today. It would almost certainly produce pleasurable effects, but it can hardly be said to be an act of love for myself or anyone else for that matter. Pleasure is almost always a byproduct of some good, but it is never the reason for it. I eat food for the sake of repairing and nurturing my body, for nutrition. And pleasure can be a side effect of that if it appears, but it's not the reason that I eat. And if I make pleasure the reason and the purpose of my eating, I will almost inevitably embrace unhealthy eating patterns. Okay, but couldn't you make this same critical analysis of an opposite sexual relationship? I would say no, because a sexual relationship between a man and a woman offers a unique good that no other kind of relationship can, which is that it has the potential to create new life, which unfolds an entirely new horizon of goods, companionship, and intimacy that mere friendship does not. So in the case of a committed sexual relationship between a man and a woman, it's easy to identify the unique good that can be willed within the nature of that relationship. But there's an inevitable retort to that argument that I've heard many times. People will say, what about people who are infertile? Are you saying that because they cannot conceive new life, that those relationships aren't examples of love or willing the good of another? And I'd like to think that it's obvious that I'm not saying that, but if it isn't obvious, let me offer an analogy that I think is going to be helpful. I want to invite you to think about the ways that we live and interact with our environment. We can live and work with our environment in such a way that respects whatever inherent harmony and balance exists there, or in ways that disregard that harmony and balance, often producing effects that are bad for the environment, for ourselves, and for our neighbors. So with that in mind, I want you to imagine two men who inherit significant plots of land that they can use for farming. This land, in both cases, features a diversity of landscape and ecosystems, like maybe it includes prairie, marsh, and forest. The first would-be farmer, he takes this responsibility quite seriously, and he studies and he learns about farming practices that respect those ecosystems, and then he puts those practices into effect. But that growing season, there is a drought, and because of a lack of rain, his crops fail. Now, the second farmer, he isn't nearly as diligent or concerned about doing the right thing. So he doesn't take the time to learn about farming practices that work in harmony with the environment. He clear cuts the forests, he irrigates the marshes, and he chases away the wildlife. He uses harsh chemicals and pesticides, and he introduces crops that are foreign to that land. He isn't interested in the health and vitality of the environment, but he only wants to extract from it what he can get out of it. And even though there is no drought in his country, his crops fail too, and eventually his land becomes toxic and sterile. Now, even though these two farms had failed crops, in other words, the effects were the same, they aren't the same thing. One operated in a way that appreciated the natural harmony of the environment, but because something was sadly missing, specifically rain, through no fault of the farmer, it didn't produce a harvest. In the same way, a homosexual relationship, by its very nature, cannot conceive new life. The only effects that it does produce is pleasure, but it can also produce serious risk and harm. For example, a University of Alabama study back in, I think, 2016 found that men who engage in anal intercourse are 3 times more likely to suffer from fecal incontinence. That's a huge difference. Other serious risks of injury and infection are significantly higher than vaginal intercourse. In the case of a couple struggling with fertility, it isn't that they have chosen something that cannot possibly produce new life. It's that sadly, like the farmer who suffered through a drought and who still did everything right, something's just missing through no fault of their own. Lastly, I want to close with a conversation about Catholic schools embracing pride symbols, if I can, for a second. Because I've tried to argue that the Catholic Church has this long-standing, tried and tested definition of love that is coherent, universal, and based on reason. And when it comes to alternative theories that might be offered in contrast and in opposition to that Catholic definition, the onus isn't on the church to prove that these are wrong, but on the theorists to prove that they are right. If you're going to say that same-sex relationships are good and loving and use slogans like "love is love," then you need to demonstrate how they are compatible and coherent with a cohesive definition of love. And I think that's lacking here. And this is especially a problem for Catholic schools, because if you're a Catholic school, if you're going to advertise yourself as an institution that will provide formation that is uniquely Catholic and compatible with the Catholic view of things, but then you're going to promote and embrace concepts of love that are incoherent and which rival Catholic teachings, then you aren't truly Catholic on the most fundamental level. Instead, you're just hijacking the Catholic name and affiliation for different purposes which aren't entirely obvious, but not actually offering a Catholic education, which is false advertising and even fraudulent. If you want to embrace concepts of love and human understanding that are not Catholic, I think that's one thing, but then you aren't authentically Catholic anymore, and you should have the courage to admit that rather than trying to have your cake and eat it too. Thanks for watching. The reason I can continue making content like this is because of the generous support of my viewers. If you feel called to support this work, then consider joining the Reinforcements, which is my online community. There are multiple tiers, including free access for those who can't help financially but still want to join. You can join up at www.brianholdsworth.ca. Certain levels will also get a free gift basket from Glory and Shine, who is a family-owned Catholic bath and body products company whose beard balm I'm wearing right now. It's like aromatherapy for your face. Even if you don't join, they make amazing products, so check them out at gloryandshine.com. And don't forget to like and subscribe. You don't have to agree with everything I said to get value out of these kinds of conversations, so be sure to subscribe to be edified or challenged. There's value in both.
Pray, brethren, that my sacrifice and yours may be acceptable to God the Almighty